89 A.D. The sun beats down on the arena of Capua, baking the blood into the sand until the air smells of copper and sweat. A gladiator stands in the center of the oval, his chest heaving, his sword dripping red onto the dust. He has just killed 3 opponents back to back. 50,000 people are on their feet, their roar vibrating through the stone foundations of the amphitheater like an earthquake. The emperor leans forward in his box and gives the signal. But the reward they offer this man isn't a bag of gold. It isn't the wooden sword that grants freedom. It is something else. The gates to the underground open and 2 guards drag a woman out into the light. She is Dacian. Her clothes are torn, her wrists are bound in heavy iron, and her eyes are wide with a terror so primal it silences the front rows. She isn't a criminal. She isn't a combatant. She is a prize. The guards don't kill her. They hand her chained to the gladiator. The crowd erupts in laughter and cheers as he drags her toward the dark, gaping mouth of the Hypogeum, the underground labyrinth beneath the arena. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a random act of war. It was a rite, a tradition, an official state-sanctioned reward encoded in the rule books of the games. Welcome to the Victoria Carnalis system of the Roman Empire. This is the part of history that Hollywood refuses to film. Ridley Scott won't show you this. Your textbooks won't print this. But the Romans did. They wrote it down with the same meticulous bureaucratic indifference they used to record grain shipments and tax revenues. The poet Juvenal wrote about it in his Satire 6. The historian Suetonius recorded it in his Imperial Chronicles. Martial described it in his epigrams without censoring a single brutal word. Rome. We think of it as the cradle of civilization. We think of white marble statutes, Stoic philosophy, and the rule of law. But beneath the aqueducts and the poetry lay a darkness so profound it defies modern comprehension. This is the story of how the greatest empire on earth turned women into human trophies for warriors covered in blood. Today, you are going to discover what Roman historians really wrote about the underground chambers beneath the sands. You will see the receipts, the ledgers, and the architectural blueprints of a system designed to strip human beings of their soul. This isn't myth. This isn't legend. This is the documented reality of what happened when the applause died down. To understand this horror, you have to understand the gladiator. Forget the romantic hero. Forget Maximus Decimus Meridius. A gladiator in the 1st century A.D. was a piece of meat. He was a slave, a criminal, or a prisoner of war. Legally, he was infamous without rights, without social standing lower than the dirt he fought on. He lived in a barracks called a ludus, essentially a prison where he was trained to die for the amusement of others. His life was a constant negotiation with death. But if he won, if he survived the trident and the net, if he butchered his way to victory, the system offered him a moment of godhood. The editor of the games, the man paying for the spectacle, would present him with a choice of rewards. Suetonius documents this in the lives of the 12 Caesars. Tacitus mentions it in his Annals. The options were standard: a purse of silver coins, a jug of fine Falernian wine, a clean bed for one night, or Victoria Carnalis. The term translates roughly to victory of the flesh. It meant access to the captivity the female prisoners of war held in the bowels of the arena. These women were Dacians, Gauls, Britons, Germans, women captured during the endless expansion of the Roman borders. They had no legal rights. They had no protection. They were not considered citizens or even people. They were rest things, property of the Roman state, and handing them over as prizes was a masterstroke of administrative evil. It didn't cost a single denarius from the imperial treasury. Why pay a gladiator in gold when you can pay him in human suffering? This wasn't just casual perversion. It was social engineering refined to a razor's edge. First, it kept the gladiators motivated. Men who lived in cages who were denied all female contact would fight harder, kill faster, and die more spectacularly for the chance to possess a woman, even for an hour. Second, and more importantly, it sent a message to the conquered. Publicly humiliating the women of a defeated nation was the ultimate power move. It said, "Look what Rome can do. We don't just kill your soldiers. We take your wives, your daughters, your mothers, and we give them to our lowest slaves as toys." The philosopher Seneca, a man who tutored emperors and wrote essays on morality, attended these games. He witnessed the machinery of death and degradation firsthand, and he wrote something that should be etched on the tombstone of the Roman Empire. "I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman, because I have been among humans." He realized that the arena wasn't just entertainment, it was a contagion. It turned the audience into monsters. Rome had turned brutality into routine horror, into bureaucracy and suffering into a spreadsheet. And everything was documented. Now that you understand the system, let me walk you through the process as described by the poets Juvenal and Martial. Let me show you what they saw with their own eyes. After a victorious combat, while the crowd was still cheering and the sandrakers were clearing the bodies of the losers, the master of games would descend into the hypogeum. This was the nerve center of the arena, a stifling, windowless labyrinth of tunnels, cages, and pulley systems. The air down there was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, exotic animals, and old blood. According to Suetonius, the gladiator, still slick with sweat and gore, would be presented with a bronze tablet. It was a menu. If he pointed to Victoria Carnalis, the process began. Martial describes this in his epigrams with chilling casualness. The victor was led down a specific corridor to the holding cells where the female prisoners were kept. Imagine the scene inside those cells. Women who had been dragged thousands of miles from their homes in the forests of Germania or the mountains of Dacia. Some still wore the torn, muddy clothing they had been captured in. Others had been prepared by arena attendants, washed with cold water, their hair untangled, their faces wiped clean. Not out of kindness, but to make them more presentable prizes. The gladiator would walk down the line, inspecting them like cattle at an auction. He would point a blood-stained finger. Guards would unlock the heavy iron chains. The woman would be dragged out screaming or silent, with shock, and taken to what Roman administrative records coldly called reward chambers. These weren't improvised corners or dark alleys. Archaeological evidence from multiple Roman amphitheaters, including Pompeii and the Colosseum itself, shows small purpose-built rooms carved into the stone foundations. They had stone benches. They had iron rings set into the walls to secure reluctant prizes. They had heavy wooden doors that locked from the outside. They were part of the architecture as planned and essential as the tunnels for the lions or the elevators that lifted fighters to the surface. The architects who designed these marvels of engineering included rape rooms in the blueprints. Juvenal, in his biting satire, Six mocks the practice, not because it was cruel to the women, but because it was low class for the empire to rely on such base rewards. He writes about women allocated as prizes to blood-soaked champions, describing it as routine as distributing bread. The selection wasn't random chaos. It was bureaucratic. A clerk, man with ink-stained fingers who went home to his wife and children every night, would stand by with a ledger. He would record the transaction. One Dacian female, approximately 20 years of age, transferred to Gladiator Gaius for Victoria Carnalis reward. Date IDs of March. Human beings reduced to inventory items debited from the stock like sacks of grain. But this system served a purpose beyond just rewarding fighters. It was a weapon of psychological warfare designed to break the soul of the enemy. Tacitus in his Annals describes Rome's strategy with conquered peoples. It wasn't enough to defeat an army on the battlefield. You had to destroy their will to exist as a separate people. You had to break their spirit so completely that they would never dream of picking up a sword again. How do you do that? You take the people they fought to protect their daughters, their wives, the priestesses of their gods, and you give them to the lowest of the low. You give them to slaves. Gladiators were infamous, the scum of society. To have your wife given to a gladiator was an insult worse than death for a Germanic chieftain or a Dacian king. Cassius Dio records a specific example that highlights the scale of this horror. After Emperor Trajan's conquest of Dacia in 106 A.D., thousands of Dacian prisoners were marched in chains to Rome. Among them were women from the tribal aristocracy, daughters of chieftains, wives of elite warriors. These weren't common peasants. They were the royalty and nobility of their culture. Rome deliberately flagged them for the arena. When Trajan celebrated his victory with a staggering 123 days of games, he used these high-born women as gladiator rewards. For 4 months, the message was broadcast to every corner of the world. This is what happens when you resist Rome. Your men die in our dirt. Your queens become our wars. Suetonius mentions this practice during multiple imperial celebrations. After a major military victory, the influx of female captives created a surplus in the slave markets. The arena managers, always looking to cut costs, would requisition these women. It was strategic, calculated, and completely legal under Roman law. The poet Martial witnessed one such distribution and wrote a line that sums up the Roman mindset perfectly. The victor takes his prize as Rome takes its tributes by right of conquest, without mercy, without shame. He wasn't condemning it. He was stating a fact of life. In the Roman mind, this was justice. The weak existed to serve the strong. The conquered existed for the pleasure of the conqueror. That was the natural order refined over 7 centuries of domination. What makes this even more chilling is how organized it was. This wasn't the chaos of a sacking, it was the administration of a state. Roman records show that arena managers kept detailed inventories of captivity available for rewards. They tracked age, origin, physical condition, and shelf life. Suetonius describes the role of the procurator munerarum, the imperial official responsible for the games. This man oversaw everything: the procurement of lions from Africa, the training of fighters, and the allocation of prisoners. These officials worked directly with military commanders. There was a supply chain. Women captured on battlefields in modern-day Romania, Germany, or Britain would be transported across the empire in cages, processed through military camps, cataloged, and eventually delivered to arena-holding facilities in Rome, Capua, or Verona. Cassius Dio mentions supply shortages during years of peace. When conquests slowed down, the availability of fresh captivae decreased. This forced arena managers to offer more traditional rewards like money, which annoyed the budget-conscious emperors. Think about that for a second. The empire's entertainment infrastructure depended on a steady supply of conquered women to function cost-effectively. Juvenal sarcastically notes in Satire 6 that some gladiators actually preferred Victoria Carnalis over cash payments. Why? Because gold runs out, but Rome's enemies are infinite. The chambers where this occurred were maintained by arena staff. Tacitus mentions attendant slaves themselves responsible for preparing these spaces. Their job was to clean the stone benches, change the straw light, the torches, and ensure privacy. Privacy not for the sake of dignity, these women had none in the eyes of the law, but to maintain the illusion that the savagery below was separate from the civilized spectacle above. Guards were posted outside the doors. not to protect the women. They could scream until their throats bled and no one would help, but to prevent unauthorized access. The reward was exclusive property of the designated gladiator. To steal another man's prize was theft. Administrative tablets recovered from Pompeii and other sites show standardized forms for these transactions. One partially preserved document reads, "Hereby granted to gladiator name for meritorious victory choice of captiva Gallic origin duration, not to exceed 1 night to be returned to holding by dawn." Returned. Like a rented tool. Like borrowed equipment. Human suffering processed with the efficiency of a library book. This is the bureaucracy of hell. But if you think the system was the darkest part, you are wrong. The true horror lies in the silence. This system required more than just gladiators and prisoners. It required everyone else to look away. Seneca wrote about sitting among Roman citizens' fathers holding their sons' hands, mothers explaining the games to their daughters, watching these spectacles unfold. And nobody objected. Nobody protested. Why? Because Roman society had normalized this through a concept called dignitas. To publicly object to imperial practices meant questioning Rome's right to rule. It meant being un-Roman. Tacitus records an incident during Emperor Tiberius's reign where a senator named Marcus Valerius publicly questioned the morality of certain arena practices. He didn't even condemn them. He just asked a question. Within a month, Marcus Valerius was accused of treason. His family was stripped of their property. He died in exile. The message was clear: watch, cheer, or at the very least, stay silent. Juvenal captures this perfectly. He describes senators bringing their young daughters to the games, exposing them to these horrors from childhood. It was socialization through spectacle. They were teaching the next generation that this was normal, that this was the price of empire, that empathy for the barbarian was a weakness. However, there were moments when the facade cracked. Moments when Rome's brutality went too far, even for its own desensitized citizens. Cassius Dio documents an incident during Emperor Commodus' reign in 192 A.D. Commodus was mad obsessed with being a gladiator himself. He began personally selecting captivae as rewards for his favorite fighters. But he broke the unwritten rule. He expanded the practice beyond prisoners of war. He started using the daughters of his political enemies, Roman citizens. He treated the daughters of senators like they were Dacian captives. One victim was the daughter of a senator named Quintus Pompeius. She was a Roman citizen, protected by the holiest laws of the state. But Commodus didn't care. According to Dio, when the guards came to take her, her father stood in the doorway to block them. He was killed on the spot. She was dragged away to the arena. That night, Rome's elite began plotting Commodus' assassination in earnest. Not because he was a tyrant, they had tolerated his madness for years, but because he had crossed the line. He had treated us like them. It wasn't a moral awakening, it was self-preservation. Tacitus records another moment of cracking during Emperor Nero's reign. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, Nero blamed the Christians. He ordered mass executions in the arena. Among them were Christian women subjected to public violations before being fed to beasts. The poet Martial was present. He described it in graphic detail. But something unexpected happened. Parts of the crowd began leaving. They didn't protest that was suicide, but they quietly stood up and walked out. Nero's guards blocked the exits, forcing them to watch. Tacitus noted that even among those who hated Christians, the spectacle produced disgust. For a brief flickering moment, Rome's citizens looked in the mirror and didn't like what they saw. But the moment passed. The spectacles continued for another 200 years. The Colosseum roared on. 400,000 people died in the arenas over 4 centuries. The lesson isn't that Rome was uniquely evil. Every civilization has blood on its hands. The lesson is that systems can make evil normal. Bureaucracy can make horror invisible. When clerks process rape, like a business transaction, when philosophers justify cruelty as justice, when citizens are too afraid or too indifferent to speak, hell becomes just another day at the office. By the time the arenas finally closed in the 5th century, Rome had been normalizing brutality for so long that it had nothing else left. It had hollowed itself out. As the poet Martial wrote in one of his darker epigrams, Rome didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it forgot what strength without cruelty looked like. The gladiators are gone. The emperors are dust. The crowds are silent. But the ruins remain. And carved into those stones is a warning for every civilization that follows a society that turns suffering into entertainment, eventually runs out of both. So that is what Roman historians revealed about gladiators and female prisoners. Not the Hollywood myth, but the bureaucratic reality recorded by Juvenal, Martial, Suetonius, and Tacitus. A system where women were inventory, where rape was a reward, and where an empire convinced itself that cruelty was the height of civilization. The Colosseum still stands in the center of Rome. Tourists take selfies. Guides tell stories of brave fighters. But beneath that sand, in the dark, stifling tunnels of the Hypogeum, history whispers a different truth. Power without limits doesn't just corrupt, it perverts. Rome conquered the world, but it never conquered its own darkness. This is history without filters. The truth that books prefer to hide.